Hello dear students, welcome to the lecture on real versus nominal GDP. In this lecture today, we will be discussing about national income, what is gross domestic product, what is real and nominal GDP along with few examples. To begin with the topic of GDP, you need to first understand where actually it belongs to in economics. GDP is nothing but a component of national income. So, what actually is this term called national income? Let us get a gist of it briefly. National income of a country means the sum total of incomes earned by the citizens of that country during a period of time over a year. In other words, it is the total amount of income accruing to a country from economic activities in a year's time. National income accounting refers to the set of methods and principles that are used by the government for measuring production and income, or in other words, economic activity of a country in a given time period. There are various measures of determining national income. Some of it are like GDP, that is gross domestic product, GNP or we call it gross national product, and NNP, that is net national product, along with other measures such as personal income and disposable income. It should be noted that national income is not the sum of all incomes earned by all citizens, but all those incomes which accrue due to participation in the production process. Individuals of a country participate in the production process by supplying factors of production which they possess. Now, what are these factors of production? So, factors of production are the inputs needed for creating a good or service, and the factors of production include land, labor, entrepreneur and capital. If we talk theoretically, then according to Marshall, the labor and capital of a country acting on its natural resources produce annually a certain net aggregate of commodities, material and immaterial including services of all kinds. This is the true net annual income or the revenue of the country or national dividend. In this definition, the word net refers to the deduction from the gross national income in respect of depreciation and wearing out of machines, and to this must be added income from abroad. That means, net amount is equal to gross amount minus depreciation plus income from abroad. National income accounting equation is an equation that shows the relationship between income and expense of an economy and other categories. It is represented by the equation y is equal to c plus I plus g plus x minus m, where y is the national income, c is your personal consumption expenditure, I is private investment and g is government spending. X represents net exports and m is imports. The most important metrics that are determined by national income accounting are GDP, GNP, NNP, disposable income and personal income. So, this was a brief about national income. I hope this term is understood by all. After understanding national income, let us now know about what is gross domestic product. GDP is the final value of the goods and services produced within the geographic boundary of a country during a specific period of time, normally a year. Also, it should be noted that GDP growth rate is an important indicator of the economic performance of a country. Within each country, GDP is normally measured by a national governmental statistical agency, as private sector organizations normally do not have access to the information required, especially information on expenditure and production by governments. It can be measured by three methods, namely the output method, the expenditure method and the income method. Let me now brief you all with the different methods starting with the output method. This measures the monetary or market value of all the goods and services produced within the borders of the country. In order to avoid a distorted measure of GDP due to price level changes, GDP at a constant price or real GDP is computed. Formula of the same is GDP as per output method is equal to real GDP. This real GDP will be at constant prices minus taxes plus subsidies. Next is the expenditure method. This measures the total expenditure incurred by all entities on goods and services within the domestic boundaries of the country. GDP is calculated using the formula GDP as per expenditure method is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus IM, where C is the consumption expenditure, I is the investment expenditure, G is government spendings, and X minus IM is exports minus imports, that is your net exports. Last is the income method. It measures the total income earned by the factors of production, that is labor and capital, within the domestic boundaries of a country. According to this method, GDP as per income method is equal to GDP at factor cost plus taxes minus subsidies. Now, let us understand the further concepts related to GDP. What is real GDP? Real gross domestic product is an inflation adjusted measure that reflects the values of all goods and services produced by an economy in a given year. When GDP is expressed on the basis of base year prices, it is called real GDP. Base year price means some price in the past fixed to be the basis of comparison. It is often referred to as constant price GDP, inflation corrected GDP, or constant dollar GDP. Put simply, real GDP measures the total economic output of a country and is adjusted for changes in price. Real GDP is a macroeconomic statistic that measures the value of the goods and services produced by an economy in a specific period adjusted for inflation. Essentially, it measures a country's total economic output adjusted for price changes. Governments use both nominal and real GDP as metrics for analyzing economic growth and purchasing power over time. This is done using the GDP price deflator, also called the implicit price deflator, which measures the changes in prices for all of the goods and services produced in an economy. The Bureau of Economic Analysis (BEA) provides a quarterly report on GDP with headline data statistics representing real GDP levels and real GDP growth. Nominal GDP is also included in the BEA's quarterly report under the name current dollar. Unlike nominal GDP, real GDP accounts for changes in price levels and provides a more accurate figure of economic growth. But what does real, the word real, mean in real GDP? Real GDP tracks the total value of goods and services, calculating the quantities but using constant prices that are adjusted for inflation. This is opposed to nominal GDP, which does not account for inflation. Adjusting for constant prices makes it a measure of real economic output for apples to apples comparison over time and between countries. What does real GDP measure? Real GDP is an inflation adjusted measurement of a country's economic output over course of a year. The US GDP is primarily measured based on the expenditure approach and calculated as GDP is equal to C plus G plus I plus NX, where C is the consumption, G is the government spending, I is investment, and NX is the net exports. Why is measuring real GDP important? Countries with larger GDPs will have a greater amount of goods and services generated within them and will generally have a higher standard of living. For this reason, many citizens and political leaders see GDP growth as an important measure of national success, often referring to GDP growth and economic growth interchangeably. GDP enables policy makers and central banks to judge whether the economy is contracting or expanding, whether it needs a boost or restraint, and if a threat such as recession or inflation looms on the horizon. By accounting for inflation, real GDP is a better gauge of the change in production levels from one period to another. What is nominal GDP? Nominal gross domestic product is GDP given in current prices without adjustment for inflation. Current price estimates of GDP are obtained by expressing values of all goods and services produced in the current reporting period. Forecast is based on an assessment of the economic climate in individual countries and the world economy using a combination of model-based analysis and expert judgment. This indicator is measured in growth rates compared to previous years. In other words, nominal GDP is the GDP calculated at current market price. Let us understand the concept nominal gross domestic product in depth now. The economy is a series of interrelated processes that determine how resources are allocated. These processes include production, distribution and consumption of goods and services along with other activities. These goods and services are required by those living within the economy. There are many ways to determine and measure how well the economy is doing. Economists watch various economic indicators such as unemployment, inflation, retail sales, industrial production and gross domestic product. GDP is a metric that measures the health and well-being of a nation's economy. It's the total value of all goods and services that are produced during a certain period of time less the value of those that are employed during the production process. There are different types of GDP including real, actual, potential and nominal. Nominal GDP is an assessment of economic production in an economy that includes current prices in its calculation. In other words, it doesn't strip out inflation or the pace of rising prices, which can inflate the growth figure. All goods and services counted in nominal GDP are valued at the prices that are actually sold that year. Now, how to calculate nominal GDP? Nominal GDP is the total value of goods and services produced within a specific economy, but just how it is measured. There are actually a couple of ways that you can use to calculate nominal GDP. The first is the expenditure approach. In order to use this method, you will have to know a few values including consumption spending, business investment, government spendings and the total net exports. This figure is derived by subtracting import expenditures from the total value gained from a country's exports. Once you have these figures, you can plug them into a formula where nominal GDP is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. You can also use the GDP price deflator method to calculate nominal GDP. This approach involves the use of the formula nominal GDP is equal to real GDP into GDP price deflator. But what is this GDP price deflator? The GDP deflator is a way of adjusting nominal output to get the real value of the output. It measures the average level of prices of all the goods and services that make up GDP. Economists use the prices of goods from a base year as a reference point when comparing GDP from one year to another. This price difference is called the GDP price deflator. Since nominal GDP is calculated using the current prices, there can be changes in the value of nominal GDP. So, we also need to understand the impact of inflation on nominal GDP. As the nominal GDP is calculated at current market prices, the growth in the nominal GDP indicates that there is a price rise instead of an increase in amount of goods produced. The rise in inflation increases the nominal GDP. The real GDP of a country can be more equal and less than its nominal GDP. Let us understand the different scenarios where there is a difference in real and nominal GDP and where can it occur. When real GDP is greater than nominal GDP. When the price level of goods and services in the base year is more than the price level of goods and services in the current year, then the real GDP will be greater than the nominal GDP. When the price level of goods and services in the base year is same as the price level of goods and services in the current year, there the real GDP will be equal to the nominal GDP. When the price level of goods and services in the base year is less than the price level of goods and services in the current year, there the real GDP will be less than the nominal GDP. If we need to consider what is better, real GDP or nominal GDP, the answer to this can be given if we take into consideration a few reasons. Real GDP helps in determining the effect of increased production of goods and services. Nominal GDP can increase even without any increase in physical output, as it is affected by changes in price also. Real GDP is a better measure to make periodic comparison in the physical output of goods and services over different years. Real GDP facilitates international comparison of economic performance across the countries. Now, let us know the difference between the real and the nominal GDP. Let us understand the difference between real GDP and the nominal GDP. If we differentiate it by the meaning, then nominal GDP is the monetary value of all goods and services produced within the domestic boundaries of a country based on the prices of the goods and services of the same year. On the other hand, real GDP is the monetary value of all goods and services produced within the domestic boundaries of a country based on the prices of the goods and services of the base year. Now, what is nominal GDP? Nominal GDP is the gross domestic product without any effect on inflation, whereas real GDP is the inflation adjusted GDP of a country. If we express them, then the nominal GDP of a country is expressed in terms of current year prices of goods and services, whereas the real GDP of a country is expressed in terms of base year prices or constant prices of goods and services. If we need to compare it using the complexity, then it is easy to calculate nominal GDP, whereas it is quite difficult to calculate the real GDP. Based on the value of nominal GDP is much higher than the value of real GDP because it takes current market changes into consideration. But the value of real GDP is much lower than the value of nominal GDP because it takes the market price of the base year into consideration. If we compare it with the previous year's GDPs, then one can compare the nominal GDP of different quarters of a country and one can compare the real GDP of a different financial years of a country. Based on economic growth, one cannot easily analyze the economic growth of a country with its nominal GDP, whereas one can easily analyze the economic growth of a country using its real GDP, as it is a good indicator of economic growth. Few key terms of today's lecture are nominal GDP. Let us understand this again. The market value of the final production of goods and services within a country in a given period using that year's prices, also called current prices. Real GDP, nominal GDP adjusted for changes in the price level using prices from a base year instead of current prices used in nominal GDP. Real GDP adjusts the level of output for any price changes that may have occurred over time. GDP deflator, a price index used to adjust nominal GDP to find real GDP. The GDP deflator measures the average prices of all finished goods and services produced within a nation's borders over time. Base year, the year used for comparison in the determination of price changes using the GDP deflator price index. The deflator in a base year is always equal to 100. So, whenever you have a base year, the deflator in the base year will be considered to be 100. Current prices are the prices at which the goods are sold in a nation in a particular year. So, current prices are used when calculating nominal GDP. Constant prices, the prices from a base year that are used to calculate GDP, real GDP in other years. This allows for a more accurate measure of how a country's actual output changes over time, because using constant prices cancels out any changes in the price level between years. With this, we have concluded with our today's topic of real GDP versus nominal GDP. I hope all of you have understood the topic. Thank you.